I guess while people are thinking of what to talk about, just an update. We got the in-pod stuff merged, both ends of the PR. So thanks, everyone, Ben, especially you all. And yeah, and for your patience on the reviews. I know it took a while. So things have seemed to have been smooth from that. But I don't know how many people have tried it out yet since it's not in the release. But hopefully, like Lynn said, in the beta 1 of 1.21, which probably comes out soon, it'll be there. And then hopefully we get a lot of people trying it out on various platforms and whatnot.
Tried it in AWS and said it works. I don't know.
Yeah, I saw that, which was great.
Exciting. Yeah, I actually went through all the GitHub and provided update. Hey, the build is available if you guys want to try it. So
yeah, I think a while back I tried it on GKE with DPV2, and someone told me it didn't work, and it seemed to work. So
oh wow, yeah, we couldn't get it working on DPV2. Was there any trick to get it working?
I think it was working, but it wasn't working with dual stack.
Oh, okay. We didn't even support dual stack at all, though.
Yeah, that's what we realized. The problem was that the WDS wasn't configured correctly.
Yeah, we need some work in general on dual stack in Ambient, I think. I mean, I don't think it's anything fundamental, just someone getting an environment and hacking away at the minor bugs and whatnot that we have in it.
So while we're waiting for an agenda, I'll just mention I have 4 PRs that I'm looking for feedback. They're not ready to be merged yet. John, I think one would interest you specifically is the blocking the egress ports. We talked about egress blocking within PodMod. So it'd be great if anybody here who's interested can take a look and give me feedback. There's 2 regarding the CNI race, one about the eBPF block, and one about preventing any chance of identity wobble with Zitano.
Okay, is that accurate, these 3?
And init container.
For what it's worth, I've looked at the top 3 at least, but not super in depth, or obviously I haven't approved any of them. But I've at least glanced at them. So they're on my to-do list. But others should look as well. So
the identity lookup, that's a big one, right? That's the one Cilium was attacking us late December last year, saying, hey, look, you guys have the same problem.
Yeah, not anymore. I mean, you can see the PR itself. There's not a lot going on there. So it's pretty simple fix. We just need to decide some technical decisions that we need to make. So it's not like it's going to merge tomorrow, but it's not a technically challenging problem.
Yuval, is the brief summary of that one just strong binding of a domain socket to the identity?
Yeah, basically, because now we have a proxy instance in the zTunnel for every pod, we do the direct lookup for the workload object using the pod's UID and not using the IP. So there's zero chance of IP wobble.
Yeah. Okay. So some of these would be options, and some of these would just be improvements, right? Like the init container, taint controller things are
so these are to solve the iris problem, and they're optional. They're you can choose neither, or you can choose one of them, and you probably don't want both of them.
Yeah,
because they're kind of doing the same thing.
Right, but the other 2, the eBPF block and the identity lookup, would be things that would always be on.
The identity lookup definitely always on. The eBPF block, I think it depends on the kernel. We don't need the eBPF block one for correctness. It's like the description says, fills a gap with a potential, a capture evasion.
Okay. But it would require a pretty sophisticated attacker to
Yeah,
take advantage of it.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. There's been a fair amount of iteration on the waypoint capture doc I brought up last week. Been some good comments. I've addressed some, I've left some open, but expanded on them in the alternatives considered section. John added an alternative section in there that I think needs to be threshed out a little bit. I think he and I are going to talk about that later today directly. But there's been some good progress in the doc. So thanks for folks for their comments. But if you haven't, take a look. I can update the notes for that. If we don't have other agenda, I can spend some more time going through some of the other the changes in that talk if people care. It's of the in-flight design docs, it's the one that's probably most important to get nailed down. Is in the authorization policy doc, which is also an area we actually need to update the link.
Yeah, that might be good. Especially if you want to cover any like recent updates to it, I'd appreciate that.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, did you say we want to open this doc? I got slightly distracted.
I was offering, if there was no other agenda, that we could spend a little bit of time running through that.
Yeah, I think that's the best use of our time. Let me know where you want me to scroll, or feel free to take over if you.
Just scroll down to the API detail. I can give a little summary of what changed there.
Cool.
So the prior version of the doc, there were 3 annotations, but mostly 2 of interest. You can now think of the changes there being mostly 1 annotation of interest, which is use waypoint. It is the means by which you say, I want traffic intended for this destination to go through that a named waypoint. There's another annotation, waypoint 4, which is basically a type descriptor on a waypoint saying what class of traffic it can handle. It's not strictly required as long as that information is available to the networking layer by other means. But it's a useful way of, particularly in situations where you say, I want all traffic, you use a namespace wide annotation, the use waypoint annotation namespace wide. You only want to do service traffic. This is a convenient way of managing that without having to go and say you have to annotate every service, but not every workload to get that behavior. But the use waypoint is overwhelmingly the most important option here. Then there was a bit of refined discussion about how to decide for any given service or workload what listener on a gateway its traffic should go to. Costin had some comments on that. There's still some open discussion about that, particularly for workloads. And then most of the examples and operational stuff was updated to address the change, which is just about the use waypoint. The most important thing, if you think about the use cases, right, you want to be able to have a waypoint that is configured to handle traffic sent to it by zTunnel, but is not actually being sent traffic by zTunnel, right? So you can test it. This seems like a very useful and important upgrade step for people doing incremental rollout. How that waypoint is configured and receives its configuration is not strictly defined by this documentation, though the Istio stock ones, right now the assumption is that they will be configured for every workload and service in the namespace in which they are defined. Though they are free to use the use waypoint and waypoint 4 annotations to refine their configuration, but that's considered an optimization and not a functional requirement of any gateway, actually. So this document really just describes the enrollment mechanisms, but gives examples. So if you go down to the examples, or maybe the operation section and incremental enablement is probably the best example. So if you look at step 1A, it creates a gateway resource and it uses one of the built-in ones in Istio and says it's a waypoint, and that will just cause a waypoint to be created in a testable state. And then you can do whatever you want in terms of policy binding to it, and only if you move down to step 2, you see the enrollment of all traffic in the namespace to be sent to that gateway, right? So it's a 2-step process. When you create it, then you can do testing on it, you can do policy changes that affect it, and then you can enable it for traffic. And obviously disable it again if you want. But that last step, right? So in typical cases, right, you'll go through those flows during an incremental rollout. And that's what we would want to enable. This document does not try and think about higher level automation that sits on top of this, although we want to make sure that it's done in a way that would work with a CI/CD system or Flagger or Ergo as previously discussed. And then there's an example operationally showing that for sidecar migration. Both of that. If we go down to the alternatives considered, well, so if you go to examples in stock Istio waypoint, right? So the very absolute simplest deployment is to create a gateway and then to annotate the namespace and say use that gateway as the waypoint, and that will roll out a waypoint. Costin?
Yeah, I don't want to go off topic too much here. We're having a separate discussion, for example, about the DNS and who can control creation of DNS entries. I think one thing that has been missing in this discussion is a personas who have the permission and can actually make the traffic go to a different destination. And for example, namespace annotation, it's good. It has some access control, but it's also bad because it's not possible with with Helm and normal stuff. We should consider the security implications of, again, who's allowed to what RBAC permissions are going to be around the annotation, or do we recommend people to use validation, or basically how do we restrict who can make this kind of super sensitive changes to how traffic is flowing?
Yeah, so one of the reasons, and it's a good question, and I'd welcome comments in the doc about it. One of the reasons why I used annotation on resources that were targets of traffic like service and workload, because that implies that if you have the ability to mutate that resource, right, you have the ability to mutate how it receives traffic. that's an advantage of using, say, an annotation instead of using an external type, right, to create a two-way association, like what you would see with something like HTTP RAG, for instance. But it's a good topic, so definitely comments welcome in the doc about it. But that was why, and also to try and mirror what we had already done, right, for sidecar injection in terms of permissions.
Louis, so this does put a little bit more onus on the developer to know about details like, there is this waypoint thing which is separate as opposed to a sidecar. Like I'm running on an ambient mesh, and hence I need to be aware of whether or not to redirect it to a waypoint, as opposed to I'm running it on a sidecar mesh, or I'm running it in some other infrastructure. Like, doesn't this make the developer have to know what kind of infrastructure he's running on?
Yes, it does. That's certainly true. And it's an interesting trade-off. On the one hand, right, without operational control, right? Well, so one, like CI/CD systems can do this, a lot of this automatically for people, right? With Gamma and with authorization policy, you'll mostly attach policies to services and workloads. That's at least assume services. And then the presence or not of a gateway and the waypoint 4 annotation or use waypoint annotation could be controlled by admins, right? And so they would control the presence or lack of infrastructure. The alternative, and it's one that's been discussed, is if you create a policy, the gateway automatically comes into existence and starts to take effect. And if you remove a policy and there are no policies that require the presence of gateway, the infrastructure goes away. I'm a little worried about that kind of model. And so my general hypothesis is we can give people the tools to implement that, but we should not implement that. Because creation and removal of infrastructure and changing the data path can have other side effects that may or may not be pleasant, depending on people. And people have different views of this, right? So I don't know that we can take a hard stance. And so when we can't take a hard usability stance like that, it seems more prudent to err in the side of giving people the operational primitives and letting them build automation on top. But feel free to put comments on that in the doc. John probably has something to say on that topic, because he and I definitely talked about it.
Yeah, I generally agree. Like, if I'd rather have a slightly verbose but really solid kind of lower level API that we can experiment with higher level abstractions on top than to build a really crappy only high level abstraction. Then there's nowhere to go from there. One question I did have, we said the listeners are auto-generated. Is that like actually written back to the gateway, or just kind of like a in-memory operation?
I think
Please write them down to the gateway, because the whole point of having them is that they will have statuses. There will be, all the tools that are built around gateway API will see them. I don't think we need to have in-memory stuff. And also the user should be able to manually create them, put custom certificate, use the full API if they choose to. I mean, it's one thing to have high-level API to optimize, but it's a completely different thing to have a low-level stuff that user can control to other controllers.
Okay, so I have given this some thought, and I think there's a few different interesting points here. For a lot, and this depends a little bit on what happens with Gamma. One, there's a limit to how many listeners you can actually have in the gateway API right now. Right, it's 16, right, John? And you're limited to 16 status entries as well. That will probably break some people, unfortunately. Because if we have to have one listener per service and you have more than 16 services in a namespace, you're toast, sadly. If we rely on listener name matching to service, as described, there's a section above which describes the ideal semantics for matching listeners to services or workloads. And I think those limitations would just break, unfortunately. But I do think we should offer a mode, right? So I think Istio should probably offer an in-memory representation, right, where we don't auto-generate a bunch of stuff or mutate a lot of resources for people who mostly don't care, which will be a large percentage of the user base. But we should actually offer an option, and I think I put it as a comment in one of John's alternatives considered, to use a different gateway class where that's what we do. We actually generate and materialize the artifacts. So that's an open discussion. And a lot of that will be predicated on how services are bound to a gateway, for which there's an active discussion, right? Because right now, the only way to bind a service to a gateway is to use a route class. And the route classes are very, very tied to the protocol and semantics and are not quite what we would want, I think. The annotation use waypoint when applied to a service and pointing at a gateway, right, which is equivalent to a route, right, in many ways, is a more direct semantic binding of a service to a listener than what you get with HTTP route. HTTP route brings a bunch of other requirements that may not actually be valid in that situation. What we're trying to do is bind a service at L4 to a listener and a gateway, right? We can also optionally choose to bind a service at the virtual host level, but we're certainly trying to do it as a VIP to listener binding in the gateway. And we don't want to make users do that manually by putting VIPs that are ephemeral into listers. So we need a stable mapping. But anyway, there's a bunch of pros and cons on both sides of whether to have an in-memory, have it materialized, and then also what else has to be materialized to make this work, which John actually, that's what John put in the bottom of the doc. So that's the good old, we could go down and talk about that. And then the limitations of the Gateway API and just in terms of cardinality, which would violate conformance and maybe break implementations. And it's a good question for gateway implementers, right? How on earth do you want to support a waypoint in, or not use the Istio stock one, you want to be a waypoint implementation. There are more than 16 services in a namespace, which not that uncommon. How are you going to use the Gateway API to represent that? Right, without the Gateway API expanding in some ways, right? And there's a variety of options, right? We could have multiple gateway resources merged into one implementation. Right, so there's a bunch of choices there, some of which get called out as options in the comments in the doc. John, if you want to go down to that section, we could talk about it.
Yeah, I do. I want to say I totally agree. Like that 16 limit and some of the other limits, I feel like they were kind of like well, I hope they were kind of like a put up roadblocks so that we don't eat too much at once. But there's no way we can go long term with these limits. They're kind of ridiculous. So we need to fix that, I think.
I know the Knative maintainers have had similar concerns around like limitations like that.
Yeah,
So
like, it's only gone this far because Gateway API hasn't yet been deployed by someone. Like we have Easter users that have 10,000 servers on their gateway, for example. Like 16 is not a large number.
But before we go into that part about fixing the upstream API, we really need one listener. We don't need 16 or I mean we have one listener of 15008 accepting connect requests with multiple routes with different host names and other things bound to it. It's not like we need to create fake listeners. We are not listening on port.
Well, actually, Costin, in the Istio case, they're not matching hosts; they're matching VIPs. VIPs are ephemeral.
That's an interesting debate. If they are matching VIPs or, I mean, all Istio APIs that I know, virtual service and so forth, are written with a host name on the match. And internally we map to VIPs or other things. I mean, it's not, we don't, people don't typically like to write IPs or to deal with IPs.
Yeah, I think, sure, we could start sending host names instead of IPs in the Connect, but I don't think it really solves the problem. Connect is not something supported by the Gateway API. So can we represent it in Gateway API and implement it Istio? Yes. But then we don't get any of the benefits of using the Gateway API and that it's universal, right?
So
So I kind of agree, and that's basically what we do today. So
what do you mean there is not connect? The HTTP Gateway API supports HTTP, and connect is one of the HTTP methods. It's not like, it's like
sure,
post.
but what we want to do when we're terminating connect at the gateway is basically two levels of processing. First, we match the connect, terminate it, and then we also process the inside stream. Like there's no way to represent that in the Gateway API, right?
Well, it's an internal details how we're doing it. I mean, for all practical purposes, a gateway is, like an HTTP proxy. Anyway, we can discuss it separately, but we have the option to use a single listener to represent this because that's really what we are doing.
Right, but then that would likely prohibit any other implementation from functioning as a gateway and being naturally configured. Right, that's the big problem. So there's a big example in this document. Actually, it's actually the first example in this document, which is using a different gateway controller as the waypoint. So, right, using Nginx. Just to elucidate the point, right, about the difficulty of doing that custom.
So someone who implemented this prototype using this within Google GFE, it is perfectly possible to do all the proxying through an existing legacy infrastructure when using POST. So POST over HTTP2 is functionally equivalent to connect.
No, it's not the, like, can we de-encapsulate an HTTP tunnel? That's not a problem, really. Although for some gateway controllers, it might be. It's after you've done that, where does that traffic go? And how is it routed, right? And the primary identifier in that encapsulation, if it's supposed to conform to service, is a VIP. It's not actually the host name, right? Because
that's something we
no, but I can today in Kubernetes do curl, destination IP to VIP dash hostname, whatever the hell I like.
Yeah, but Louis, if
that's not a feature.
The person that's writing the outer connect, it can choose to put the service IP, but it could also choose to put the service host name, and it's still orthogonal from the host name that the user set, right? There's actually
it would have to be the authoritative host name for the VIP, right?
Yeah.
Which is effectively the equivalent mapping, right? Like, so fine.
Yeah. Maybe we can pause and I can go over some of the things I've written, because I feel like a lot of the answers I'm giving could be explained a lot by referencing things. But Mike, you can go ahead if you would like.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm typing stuff in chat.
Yeah. One thing, by the way, Louis, you mentioned the HTTP route doesn't really map well because we're talking about VIPs. One thing that's interesting in the Gamma specification that differs from Istio's virtual service, and actually Istio implements it wrong and we failed the conformance test here, so we need to fix that, is that when you bind an HTTP route to a service, we're not doing a host name match, even though it's an HTTP route. They actually are binding to the cluster IP. Is
the Gamma specification problem or an Istio problem?
It is something that was intentionally specified in Gamma, and Istio doesn't implement it because it's hard. I personally, at least, think that is the correct specification. Otherwise, I would have pushed back on it harder. But Gamma is also experimental, so if we really hate it, now's the time to try and change it or make it implementation specific or whatnot. I've wanted Istio to behave like that for a while. We just haven't. It's very hard to make a change like that. So, anyhow, so one thing I will say, like, this is something I wrote up, I don't know, a couple of days ago. I intentionally didn't read Louis' updates on the doc, so I had kind of a clean room design, and then the intent was to kind of merge the ideas together. So this is not intended to be totally different from Louis and draw no inspiration. This is just a starting point. So what I was looking at is, can we represent things in kind of a different way and kind of following the Gamma style of service bindings. And so what I have here is like this diagram. On the top of the line is what the user actually creates. And on the bottom half is a controller would take that and generate some stuff that actually actuates it. So we have pretty simple setup. We have a service, we can attach some routes, and then you can maybe have some policies attached to these if you want. Obviously, that's not required. Under the hood, like, this is exactly how you would use Gateway API with sidecars today, right? Under the hood now, though, we want this to be implemented by some actual load balancer. So we would actually take these resources and convert them to standard, not mesh gateway API resources. So there's all sorts of variations and tweaks and customizations we can offer. The way I had it set up in the prototype that I've built out is that we build up one gateway for each namespace. This is definitely going to need to be customizable, but this is what we have for now. Set up a listener for each unique port. It doesn't have a host name match because we handle that in the routes. And then we also set up a route for each route, which is not amazing. But so if they have 10 routes, we create 10 kind of mirror routes. And it has all the same rules, but we have custom host names. I should have replaced this. This would be like the actual host name of the service, like foo.service.cluster.local. So this kind of ties back to what I was saying to Louis earlier, that we could put the host name in the connect and match that. And then it references this gateway. So there's some details here, but some interesting things about this is that you could implement this with, oh, sorry, one more thing is we would also annotate the service with kind of a reference to the waypoint. I had it in my prototype as just the IP address to reach it at, but Louis mentioned it could be a reference to the gateway itself, and then the implementation could find that. Either one I think is fine. The interesting thing about this is we can have variations on the transport protocol. So at its simplest, like we could offer a non-TLS solution. We could also offer TLS. And so if it's not TLS, all we need is for the node network to know that when I call this service, I should actually redirect it to this service instead. This is extremely trivial to implement in these existing node networking stacks. Like even something like kubeproxy, I doubt they're going to implement this anytime soon at least, but they could, and it would be honestly like 10 lines of code change. It's very simple. I did a prototype with Cilium, and again, it's like a IP equals new IP. Like it's a very trivial change there. Now, of course, like we don't want to encourage not using TLS, I think, so it's maybe not even something we offer, but it is interesting that just with that very tiny change, this can work. And like Louis mentioned, like this gateway could be any class at all. So in my prototype, I happen to use the Google load balancer. It could be Istio, it also works, could be Nginx, could be anything. These are just standard gateway API constructs. Now, we could also do TLS, and we absolutely should, and then we'd add a requirement that the node networking stack encapsulates with TLS. That still doesn't need to be HBone necessarily, because HBone's probably, it's not something we can represent in the standard gateway API. So if we wanted to plug in like Nginx or something, we could just use standard TLS. And what we would do is put the service name in the SNI and do all the routing based on SNI. And so even though in that case, we are doing kind of an SNI match, it's still, the SNI is derived from the service IP, so it's still technically an IP match. Like it's not literally an IP match, but semantically it's the same. So if you have the case where you curl service A with some bogus host name, we could still route it correctly to service A. Yeah, there's some details here about some details, and some stuff needs to be ironed out, but this is the general idea. The really interesting thing, I think, is that you can actually take an existing cluster that uses gamma style routes for sidecars, and it should kind of just work with waypoints. That being said, like some of the authorization policy stuff will need to work out quite a bit. So that really is only tied to the route level. I don't, definitely not promising like click a button and you're settled on Ambient and it works. I think it wasn't even really one of my main goals when I was trying to spec this out. It was kind of a accidental nice to have that I found, but like it by the prototype like passes the mesh conformance test, for example. Yeah, we have hand. I think Eitan was first. And by the way, I can share the prototype. It's just really messy, so that's why I didn't post it here. But it's not a secret. I think it's on my GitHub.
I fat fingered the hand button. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, Kasim.
Yeah, so we discussed this in the past, my opinion. I think we are digging the hole even deeper in doing Istio specific things and kind of taking mistakes from Kubernetes and amplifying them. The practice for 30 years, or how much time has been HTTP has been around, is for HTTP to use authority for routing to be one IP for thousands or millions of hosts, and to be able to have massively multi-tenant HTTP servers that you can have 1 million hosts, host names and services served by one single. I mean, Knative or most of the web hostings, we use the same techniques too. And TLS is the same situation. You can have a single IP for the entire mesh, and that will work perfectly fine. We are spending too much time trying to replicate the weird thing where we take an L4 service, which is Kubernetes service has been designed for L4, and trying to treat it as that is a standard that each HTTP service is using VIPs and it's using mapping. And I think this is kind of the same model here, where we are focusing too much on the service and the service VIP. That's my concern.
I think one of us is misunderstanding the other. I'm not sure if it's me or you. But in my mind, this is actually meeting what you're saying. Like in the gateway itself, there's no notion of IP address at all. We just have a host name match for every service that's enrolled on.
Then we're okay. I mean, you said something about the
no, so it's
SNI being the IP or VIP.
No. The SNI would be the service host name.
Okay, as long as it's a host name.
The node networking stack would know what host name to set based on the L4 IP address.
My misunderstanding. Sorry. As long as IPs are not in the picture, I'm perfectly happy. I just want to make sure that we are conforming with HTTP standards, not with some weird stuff.
I think what John is saying is IPs are in the picture at the L4 layer, but we canonicalize the mapping to the service host name so that it is stable.
Yeah.
Sounds good. I mean,
once you end up on this bottom layer, like these gateways and routes are just 100% exactly how you would do it if you were doing it manually, except you probably want to have cluster.local DNS names.
So one way to test this is to have a single IP allocated for the waypoint and then dynamically route it. So basically, it's a single.
Right. Well, yeah, that is exactly how it works.
Okay.
I mean,
if that works, then I'm happy.
Like this is just a gateway that's Google load balancer. It gets assigned one IP address and it works. By the way, I didn't mention this, but in theory, I know Costin, you really like custom DNS names. Here, I had host names would be like the service host name, but we could also say like some way to represent a custom host name and stick that there, and then it should keep working. So,
yeah, quick PSA: the IETF has apparently is moving to have .internal as officially assigned for internal use cases. So I love to see more .internal use in the examples of .local, which is multicast DNS. So
is that still in the comment phase, or has that passed?
I can find the announcement.
Okay, thanks, Costin.
So there's all that kind of host name matching stuff for which there's some details, but like as long as there's stable canonicalization, the difference between IP and host name is largely irrelevant, right, to the overall machinery. So I'm just going to gloss over that because I think that applies equally to both variations. There's not a lot of difference, right, between what John is proposing and the other proposal. I don't think actually. There's some important mechanical things that are worth thinking from a UX standpoint. Like, is it nice to materialize resources? For some use cases, yes. Maybe for some other use cases, no. We'd have to think about that. There's a question about enablement, right? We still want, I think, John, two-step enablement. I can create a gateway with all the routing and rules, but not use it, right? So I can test it, right? And
yeah, you can skip this step, basically. Have like a dry run or something on the route that specifies not to copy it over. I think that's a useful feature I didn't think of, but I think it makes perfect sense.
Right, and so there's that kind of, I want to create the gateway with all its rules and power, and then I want to use it or not use it for some subset of traffic or some scope, and then there's a just UX discussion about what the scoping is. I think the third thing, and I think we're vehemently in agreement that basically what we're talking about is a codification of a mapping from Gamma to Gateway. Right, we could actually just kind of standardize this within the Gamma spec roughly, and then just say, look, here's how that type of system should work. It may be not necessary to the level of conformance, but as a kind of guidance and proposal. And say, look, you could actually have one implementation of Gamma. All it does is materialize gateways. Right, and that's the reference implementation of Gamma. And then your job as a service mesh is to just send traffic to those gateways, more or less. Which is appealing, actually, I think. Mike?
Yeah, I think that I understand the impetus and desire to do something like that. I also think that we get a lot of the benefits of conformance and of like an understandable and compatible gateway API implementation without actually like suggesting that as part of the spec, because I think that is like pushing some of like Istio's ambient implementation details with the waypoint into a place where it may be harder to get other meshes to implement that structure. I think it's worth like talking about it and like doing a blog post of like, hey, this is how we're implementing Gamma by translating this to these resources that are also compliant. But I think that it would be harder to get agreement on making it like a suggested or required part of the spec.
Yeah, no, it's more like it might be useful for conformance, but it's probably too much for conformance. I agree with that.
I think we get a lot of the benefits though. Like I at a high level like the idea and like the proposal, and I definitely want to spend more time reading through it.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not suggesting that Istio become a reference implementation for Gamma. The other thing that we obviously have to address, so I like policy attachment to service. Like we obviously did that with HTTP route, which is one form of policy. We'll almost certainly end up doing it with authorization policy, right? For the same reason here, right? Those are the main policies, or others obviously. But we also have to deal with workload, right? And so one big discussion point is, what policies, how does this work for workload, this pattern? There's obviously, we can materialize it, but we just have to think through that and also have to think about the effects about, okay, well, if we're going to map that into the gateway API, how would we do policy attachment in the gateway API derived as policy attachment from Gamma, where Gamma was addressing workload? Logically, even if we didn't try and upstream that, right, we try to align with the principles. Tom?
Yeah, one thing also, I don't know, this doesn't feel directly related to anything, but seems useful to mention. In Google Cloud, we actually did something vaguely similar to this, where we took, we called it like a composite gateway, where basically a user would create a gateway of a special class. And under the hood, we would create two different gateways. And the idea is kind of to sync up the Google load balancer to the Istio load balancer, because there's various benefits of running both of them together. I do something very similar to this, where there's like a couple of gateway API objects user creates, and under the hood, we create a ton of other gateway API objects and hook everything up together for them. It might propagate status between them and whatnot. So there is some prior art here, doing similar types of things of like gateway to gateway translation that we can draw on for some inspiration.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities. So I guess one question for the broad audience here, right, would be the materialization question, right? We have a choice, right? We can treat Gamma as a concrete implementation that doesn't need materialization into gateway, right, and try to standardize it. There are probably some deficiencies in routing for services that we would need to address within Gamma to do that. To create a more strong association between a service and a gateway than is expressible through HTTP route. So we might need to create a new binding type, and there's just a comment on that. And then there's just the UX of materialization itself. Obviously, materialization is, and we can choose to give users the choice, right? Istio can say, well, we can give you a non-materialized one, and so you don't get all the clutter. And if you need to do an integration, we can give you materialization like this, right? Either or. It's not one or the other. And then the UX pros and cons of each, and the maintenance costs of doing one or the other or both.
Don't we have enough many ways to do a thing? I mean, it's, how do we call it? I want to be non-conformal to standards, or what would be the purpose of giving the user this choice? And just that we create too many resources. I mean, it's not really a lot of space.
If you're using stock Istio things, right, and not integrating, you don't need the generation, right? There's no attachment point that's being generated.
We as in users who
users.
Yeah, but users have all kind of tools that are now being, kubectl, get whatever. I mean, there are all kind of tools that are being built around the gateway API, and I would expect you status.
Like I just said, those are integration requirements, Gustin. If you're just using the policies to achieve the effect that you need, and the policies are sufficient for your use case, you don't need that stuff. Right?
Okay, maybe. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we have an option for users who, just don't want to use any other tools than Istio, and don't want to use Kubernetes standards, basically. So I don't like Kubernetes. I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, I think the reasons why you may want to turn generation off is it may cause confusion, but it may also limit troubleshooting, and it may be scaling issues if we have to do these kind of mirror routes. Is it so much to double the routes? It's probably not that bad. Maybe it is. I don't know. Remains to be seen. I do kind of agree that the bottom half is like kind of an implementation detail. Just like I don't well, I don't know. I mean, if you create a deployment, do I care if there's a replica set, or do I just care that I get the behavior? I'm not sure. In Gateway API today, we translate Gateway API resources to virtual service, and we keep those in memory. We don't expose them. We could have exposed them. I can see it going either way. It's hard to make a call as to whether we should support one or the other. I say that the supporting the generation is absolutely required for integration. It's really a matter of if it's illegal to not do it. So, for example, if we support the generation, then we can say we support AWS L7 load balancers waypoints like today, and they can't do anything about it. Meanwhile, if Google or Microsoft or someone involved wants to make it more optimized because maybe this isn't efficient, like they could just directly translate HTTP route to Azure load balancing resource instead of going from HTTP route to HTTP route to Azure load balancer resource, or whatever the flow is, right?
Yeah, I was just going to mirror that. I think, in my experience, having, mirroring CRDs into the cluster actually ends up taking a lot more time than you might expect. And at scale can really be, can start to get in the way. So I think that at first, it's probably not a big deal. And again, I think we need to support generating them, but I do think that there is definitely a use case for having them in memory, and like anytime you have to go through etcd, it can be a problem. So I think just acknowledging that is important.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I think the other thing, yeah, because Glue Enterprise does a crap load of that, and we definitely hit issues with it. The other thing is there's also a compositional question, right? Well, you generate all the resources, and then because of the inverted nature of policy attachment in the Gateway API, I can attach to them. And what does that mean? Right? Because you created this implied API contract that you may not have meant to imply, or maybe you did mean to imply, right? But like there's definitely that as well, right? I could go and like we do all this, we generate all the things that includes generating, let's say, a gateway with like the Nginx gateway class, and then somebody manually writes an Nginx specific policy resource and attaches to it somewhere, and then we change our mapping for whatever reason. Maybe we had a bug and it breaks. Whose fault was that, right? Like Obviously, putting a lot of time and effort into standardizing the gateway API should mitigate some of those issues, but it won't completely eliminate them. Like we can see that we have both problems. So my stance is I'm not opposed to generation, but I think there are good use cases for not doing it. And that may be the more common option, at least for installations of Istio distributions, but maybe not for Istio compatible distributions from vendors.
So, I don't disagree. I mean, if we want to implement more options, that's fine. My requirement is if a user decides to ignore all the UX and stuff and use whatever UI tool they want or some foreign tool to create the resources as they should be. I mean, Nginx, HTTP route, everything, creates them by hand. zTunnel and the rest of the system should work. We should not require.
Oh yeah, no, that is 100%.
As long as,
yes,
yeah,
we're all in 100% agreement about that, right? Like half of this document is about that. All right, how to make that work manually, what the contracts are. So yeah, no argument there. Obviously, there's an interesting discussion to be had about we have to define what that means in terms of conformance, but that seems tractable, so I'm not too worried about that. We can define tiers right around our Istio APIs versus the gateway APIs, and what vendors do or don't do with those things and their own extensions. Overall, I would say that the two versions of the proposal are actually pretty in sync. Right, there's some variations on a few points, but they're probably quite reconcilable. I think mostly have to do with the opt-in mechanism, John, actually.
Yeah, I agree. So is it accurate that on your proposal, ultimately you end up with basically the same bottom stuff on the generated config? I don't think it is, right? There's a listener per service in yours, but it's close at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the only technical difference in how the mapping would occur, which should be reconcilable.
Yeah, I guess one question I have actually is, what is the certificate we want to serve on the waypoint? Is it always the spiffy one, or do we also want to allow like a certificate per service that's the the normal DNS one?
So one of the headaches, obviously, in the gateway API is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is, so there's like the networking, like what we do with zTunnel and the spiffy identities, the workloads. And then you may, right, one use case is actually, I have an old client that's still using TLS and I want to stop it, right? But I need all the new clients to use plain text because they're on a secure network. And so I have to use application level TLS, right? I remember hearing a use case from a bank about this, right? And they're just, they want to get away from ad hoc application level TLS and use something like HBone and zTunnel, but they need a way to migrate clients. So they wanted to do application specific TLS. And because TLS is per listener in the gateway API, you had to have a service by service mapping for services to listeners to do that. That was the other reason why I had a listener per service. Was if you really needed to do that, you could attach TLS to it. Now, the workaround is to just create another listener and create a custom route right for that, and just address that by having a mergeable gateway. And then tell the client to switch, but it could create a little bit of a migration headache. Because if we just have one listener, right, and rely on routes to partition services, we lose the ability to partition TLS in the API. It's a massive headache, right? Mike?
Yeah, that was my question, is if we have a single gateway per service with a single listener and then rely on the allowed gateway merging behavior in the data plane, does that potentially let us do something that works?
I mean, that's the same as multiple listeners per gateway, right? It's not really any different.
I'm wondering basically if it lets us get around some of the restrictions of like the 16 limit.
Oh yeah,
other
yeah,
things.
yeah. We can shard, right? Like have
Yeah, exactly.
generate 7 gateways if you happen to have 50 whatever like services. Like we can do crap like that.
Yeah.
It gets a bit ugly, obviously, right? It can be a little churny. But yes, like we can obviously do that. Like certainly if user says I want generation to be on because it needed for integration, that's probably going to happen with all its quirks and pain. And John proposed a scheme roughly for doing that, right? Which is you basically each generated resource is a back pointer to its origin, or at least the generated gateways back point to a kind of overarching one. And I think I proposed that, right, John, to say, look, and we use that as the provisioning and deprovisioning mechanism for the resources, the actual compute running the damn things. So that solved the kind of two-phase enablement problem. So something like that. It's just ugly, right? I mean, that could lead to a lot of artifacts getting generated, but if that's what you want, that's what you get.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering, like, if honestly, like, rather than arbitrary sharding of like 7 gateways for 50 services or something like that, if we just had a single gateway per service, because that lets you at least know exactly like what thing to look at, and how, and probably makes some of the implementation easier. And then if we under the hood merge them all into a single data plane potentially.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of potential mappings. I have quite a few pros to your suggestion. I just haven't thought about it too much.
Yeah, I got kicked out. I didn't hear the final on the certificate, but for any interoperable stuff, I suspect we'll need to support regular real DNS certificates with proper, because again, Istio SPIFFE, it's Istio specific. It has specific semantics with secure naming and the Z-tunnel stuffs, and I don't see any other choice than to also support standard DNS certificates for gateways. I mean, I don't know. There is no chance for everyone to adopt Istio SPIFFE format and to use SPIFFE and secure naming, because that requires an Istio D and it's entire.
Yeah. So I mean, in theory, you could attach a TLS policy to a service, right? Follow the gamma semantics for that, and then the system would generate an application level TLS binding, right, on the generated gateway artifacts that mirrored that, and you got the behavior that you want. Right? Those are all. So that's all aligned with the attach policy to service or workload, and use that as the generation, and then we can pick what service, like what policies we want. And if you have something like Z-tunnel, then you get its benefits. If you don't, then you have to do a little bit more work in terms of policy to get the behavior that you want.
And that's why generated resources come in, because if you use Cert Manager, for example, and other stuff, they can automatically create you a DNS certificate, even a public DNS certificate attached to the gateway, and you can do a lot of stuff that, and the proper way to put the certificate for a gateway is in the listener, because that's where it can be in clouds, I think. But anyway.
So these all seem like resolvable things. John and I are certainly on the same page about policy attachment to service triggering, like being the user UX, right, in terms of what you do with policies. The machinery underneath can vary between materialized and non-materialized. And then we can debate the details of the mapping. But there are certainly a variety of mappings that work for use cases, and we can probably refine them. Like if we want to offer the option of, like, as John said, look, plain text, like there's no Z-tunnel, right? There's just a waypoint. It's configured to do these things on behalf of services. The UX is you do policy attachment to service. This thing gets generated, either materialized at runtime or in config, and still materialized at runtime. And then you use different mechanisms to redirect traffic to it, whether manual, like go change your application, automatic, something built into the CNI, or Z-tunnel. And they all three work. more or less. If we could show, and ideally the gateway configuration mostly doesn't change between those three things, then I think we're in good shape. It might not entirely be achievable, but it doesn't change, but you could probably get pretty close.
Well, Louis, thanks for the deep dive on the doc, and John too.
Yeah, and anyway, I'd like to try and at least get some version of this finalized because we could start implementing it.
Agreed. I'll take a deeper look this week, and I'll probably ping both of you on a couple of things that I'll need some clarification on.
Yeah. Once we get this to the kind of implementable point, I'll probably go back to the conformance document and the authorization policy document. Because obviously they have a lot of overlap with this, but this is the one that I'd like to get done sooner. Because I think it has the most, it's the most immediate, obviously, next step.
I'm going to take another read through later this afternoon. So thanks for the covering all the kind of salient points. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's great discussion. And think about workloads too. You know, like we talked a lot about services, but we have to think about workloads.
Yeah. All right. Well, see everybody Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Right. Bye.
Bye, y'all.